What you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences. And I've always sort of found you would see things that you would not automatically have come across.
Hello, and welcome to the Parliamentary Review Podcast, the podcast that's obsessed with raising standards. I'm guest host Matthew O'Neill, and in each episode of the podcast, we're joined by directors, CEOs, CFOs, government ministers, chairmen, and presidents. And perhaps even, once his busy season is over, Father Christmas. The aim is to discover who these people are, the people who get up each morning and make Britain work. We discuss everything from industry lurchers to charities and churches, and of course, the successes that make it all worthwhile in the end. We also get their take on the political and economic state of the country. Later on in this episode, you'll have the chance to hear our exclusive interview with Lord Pickles, former Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, Chairman of the Conservative Party, and of course, current co-chair of the Parliamentary Review. But for now, we're joined by Stephen Ibbs, Managing Director at Data Development. Data Development work with charities and churches to help them adapt to a predominantly cashless and online world, creating software for them to allow cashless donations and accountability. And now, we welcome Stephen. Hello, Stephen.
Hi, Matt.
So, it's been a year since Data Development's appeared in the review. What have you and the firm been up to in the ensuing time?
We released our cloud-based version of our accounting package for churches and charities in February, and that's gone incredibly well, far better than our expectations. So a lot of the year has been spent working and developing and expanding that.
Fabulous. Now, you're in a really good place in the market at this moment in time, but I'd like us to pull back the cloth a bit on this. A lot of the work that you do these days revolve around cashless transactions, but we would have been looking at a very different scene in the mid-'80s when you started. Talk me through the origins of your business and what you were doing back then.
Absolutely. Well, the company started, Data Development started in 1985, which was really the same time as the birth of the home PC. And we started from a request from a local charity for a membership system. So our first membership system was on the Amstrad PCW at that time, which required floppy disks to use the software and use the data in there. And then we developed it onto the IBM PC with DOS, and then onto Windows, and then more recently onto the cloud. So you can use it from any device, PC, Mac, tablet, iPad, even a mobile phone. So we've really travelled, as technology has travelled, we've travelled from one person having one computer, maybe on the desk in an office, to being able to be used by virtually everybody who's got a mobile phone in their pocket. So a large amount of change, technological change, in the last 30-odd years.
Well, certainly, it seems like quite a hefty amount of floppy disks to be carrying around with you these days, if we were to carry the computing power in our phones in our pockets. So the infrastructure that you provide feels very much like the natural next step for the industry as the world goes cashless. What has the uptake been like? Is it increasing?
It is. There's a lot more interest in the cashless donation. So we were really very much at the beginning of it for churches and charities and doing the cashless donations. So initially there was some scepticism over it, but that's very quickly been cleared. And now everyone's driving forward to get cashless donations, particularly for churches and charities in, as society in general carries less cash with them.
Well, that is a very challenging development to be pushing through in an ever-challenging world. So what are the primary challenges that you face as a business?
The primary challenges, certainly for the contactless at the time, it was where people would donate, they could also gift aid their donation at the time. Moving at the time over to contactless or cashless, you lost that ability to do gift aid initially, which would bring down the worth of donation by about 25p in the pound for each of the charities. So for us at that time, we wanted to enable charities to benefit from the cashless and also retain the ability to do gift aid on top of that, which nobody else in the market was doing at the time. So that's something that we work very hard with the contactless terminal manufacturer, so that somebody just tap the card and then later on gift aid can be claimed on it without them having to stand at the terminal and enter all their details in. We want to know where people just tap and go, the next person can tap and go, and then later on gift aid can be claimed automatically through it. So that was a new innovation that no one had done. So that was very interesting and challenging at the time.
Fabulous. Now, are you content at perfecting your art with charities and churches, or are there potentially top secret plans to move into a different field?
Naturally, there are top secret plans with the development of the software. So we're moving the development forward. Again, still online, still enabling and simplifying the administration for churches and charities, particularly with the accounting side. The regulations for churches and charities on their accounting side are quite detailed and quite specific and quite often more onerous than they are for businesses. So a lot of our users are volunteers. They might not be trained bookkeepers or accountants. They're volunteers that have been asked to do the job. So our emphasis is to make the software do all the heavy lifting. So they simply enter the transactions or even import them from bank statements, and then everything regulatory-wise, the person does automatically for them. So that's, as regulations change, that can be quite an interesting challenge at times to make it easy and simple for a user to enter the information, but also produce the analysis and to meet all the regulations that's required.
Do you feel that regulations are currently going in a direction that makes it easier for your business, or in the other direction?
That's a good question. I think I would understand why the regulations are coming in for it. It's to give transparency to the donors. The donors feel more trust in the charities that they're giving money to. There's certain aspects of it, the regulations can be a challenge for us to make the software meet the new regulations. But the background to it is I understand why the regulations are there, but it does pose problems.
Now, if
I have to say that again. Just pose problems.
Now, if we pivot back to technology, does your industry tend to be one that moves quickly in terms of technology and innovation? And if that's the case, is there anything on the horizon that you're particularly excited about?
I think generally the churches and charities are close to the front, but not normally right at the forefront. I think they're more likely to see what technology is settled and is working before they'll make a leap onto it, which is understandable when you're dealing with money that's been donated to you. You don't want to necessarily jump into something and end up losing money. So it needs to have a good basis behind it. The technology coming up, I think there's a whole world that's coming up, a whole world of opportunities from new technology to really help and benefit churches and charities. A lot of that will be to do with online and connecting different systems together. So we're working at the moment with our membership system to enable that to be online so that anybody, wherever they are, can then enter the membership system, which connects to the donation system, which connects to the accounting system. So rather than having a disjointed software package, it all becomes one unified package, which again simplifies the administration for the charities and enables them to concentrate on the work that they set the charity up for, rather than admin.
Well, it sounds like a very interesting prospect. I know that you say that connecting within the industry and getting feedback from the sector is important. How do you go about doing this, and what sort of effect has this had on yourself and your business?
Feedback from our users is actually one of the parts I enjoy most about the role that I do. So we go through and do training events, we do conferences, we do open days, and we have discussions with beta users, panel users of our software. But it can be very easy to sit isolated in an office, to see the regulations and work on it from that point of view. It's only when you actually speak to, or in our case, we have a number of staff in the office that volunteer for organisations. So it's only when you speak to the people actually using it or using it yourself in real life that you see all the little parts and minor changes sometimes that can make a big difference in there. So for me, meeting the people that are using it, discussing it with them is absolutely key in there, and a very enjoyable part of what I do.
Well, obviously, person-to-person interaction seems to be very important to you. As you've written in your article in the review, you try and foster a family atmosphere within the business and with partners. How important has this ethos been to your organization, and how do you try and create it?
The family ethos within the company is really important. It was actually, data developments were started by my father in the mid-80s in there, and he was instrumental in setting up and developing the company in the early years. And then I joined the company, and then, strange enough, my mother joined the company after it. So in that sense, it was very easy to foster a family feeding to the company because a lot of the family was involved.
Quite natural, someone might say.
Absolutely. But my parents now retired, but we still kept that family ethos running throughout the company. So we have get-togethers, normally monthly within the company, outside for social events with the company. We do sponsored events with it. We have away days, we do Christmas meals. So we do all sorts of things that are outside the company, just for social, just to get together and relax with each other. Nothing to do with work. No work is discussed. It's just downtime and relax. And if staff want to join from the company, absolutely, they encourage and welcome. If they don't want to, if they're committed on other things, that's absolutely fine. But I think all the ones this year, everyone from the company has joined in, which has been really encouraging.
Well, that's absolutely fantastic. It seems like you are on the right track there, because it must mean that you have a rather happy workforce. But if we could turn ourselves to the future, where do you see your industry in 10 years' time?
I think the next 10 years are going to be challenging for the industry in there, for the church and charity market in there. I think the move to contactless, to digital giving is absolutely key. And for those that aren't able to make that movement, I think they're going to really struggle. Because in 10 years' time, I think very few people will deal with cash, will deal with checks. Everything will be done online with credit, debit cards, contactless donations. So I think over the next 10 years, there'll be a big movement to try and encourage those off. And unfortunately, I think those that don't do it as well might struggle in 10 years' time.
And how can we help those individuals along who may fall by the wayside?
I think software and technology is the way to do it, making it as easy as possible for people to transition from where they are, which could be paper systems in there, onto something that's very easy to use but meets regulations, and then step by step guides them to where everyone needs to be or will need to be in 10 years' time. So support, training is what we do, online videos, all those sort of things will all help people learn different methods, different ways of learning to move things forward.
You said earlier that you tend to work quite a lot with churches and volunteers who staff those venues without making a sweeping generalization. A lot of them tend to be of an older generation. Do you find that they adapt quite easily to your technology, or is it a bit of a steep learning curve? We find that people adapt easily forward. So if you look generally, you might say that there's the older generation, but actually there's a whole wide range of nicks that we're coming in against more across on a day-to-day basis in there. And the older generation seem as keen to adapt new technologies to move things on, particularly where they see that it saves them time, saves the work, or automates things. Mm-hmm. So where it's going to free up their time or mean that they don't need to worry so much about the regulations or stress about them,
the programme just does it for them. So it's actually not too challenging at all to move people on. They actually seem very keen when they see the benefits from it.
Well, that is a very bright outlook to be wrapping up with here. I would like to thank Stephen very much for joining us today on the podcast. Thank you, Stephen. And I do hope that we hear again from you soon.
Yep, thank you very much.
I hope you all enjoyed our chat with Stephen Ibbs, and especially learning more about the challenges facing the sector and how the whole team at Data Developments are continuing to raise standards. If you haven't heard it before, coming up now is host Jonathan White's interview with the Parliamentary Review's co-chair, Lord Pickles. Lord Pickles was Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government under David Cameron, before receiving a peerage in 2018. Lord Pickles remains active as the UK's anti-corruption champion and the country's special envoy for post-Holocaust issues, as well as being a keen vexologist or flag enthusiast to you and I. I hope you all enjoy listening. Back to Jonathan.
Eric, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Now, I'm sure you won't mind me reminding the listeners that you've been involved in politics, both local and national, for quite a number of decades. Indeed, before the days we were in the common market. Given your experience over those years, what thoughts have you had over the last few weeks and months about the current political situation the country finds itself in?
The situation is quite dire because we have a parliament that is by and large useless. It's like a bored teenager on a long drive, and it knows what it doesn't want, and it's so bored with Brexit, but it can't agree. So no matter what you put up, it's against it. Are you in favour of a referendum? No, I don't want that. Are you in favour of remaining within the single market? No, I don't want that. Are you in favour of... No, I don't want to do that, no. And are you in favour of leaving without a deal? No, we don't want to do that. So it's against everything, but there isn't enough votes to be in favour of something, and it could be by the time this podcast goes out that Boris has started on the process of the bill, because we'll be voting on that today. But even then, what people don't seem to understand, this is not the end of Brexit.
Right.
This is barely opening the door of Brexit. We've got years of negotiations about trade agreements, relationships with Europe, putting down pieces of legislation. We get our agriculture, our fisheries, our financial services into place. Brexit is going to go on and on and on and on. I'm sure we are.
Now, the question is, I should actually remind listeners that we are talking on the day that the second reading of the European Withdrawal Act will take place. So, as we speak, we don't quite know. As, well, perhaps like the government front bench, don't know what's going to happen. You compare Parliament to a petulant teenager. What do you do to a petulant teenager to sort it out? Is there a chance that it will see sense and push this through this bill without making amendments? Is there a chance it will vote for its own for a general election? How do you see this playing out at the moment?
The sensible thing will be to put this deal through, because I've always been of the view a deal is better than no deal, because this is just the beginning. In order to start the process of Brexit, start the process of the United Kingdom taking over powers that it's not really exercised for 40-odd years, the smart thing is to get this thing through now. But in a way, it's not about Brexit itself. If there was a free vote, this deal would have gone through. Mrs May's deal would have gone through. But it's about politics. It's about a Labour Party that thinks it has a chance, trying to make the Prime Minister, whether it was Theresa May or Boris Johnson, look as though that they are in office but not in power, of delaying as long as possible. There's a lot of talk about an election in the autumn, maybe back end of November, beginning of December. something for us to look forward to before Christmas. It's beginning to look less likely. It's beginning to look as though they might want to drag it into spring to get as far away as possible from the rather decisive moment that Boris came back with a deal. We have to remind ourselves that nobody thought he could deliver a deal, and it does quite shock them. And if you remember, all this process went through in order to ensure that we were left without a deal. When we have a deal, suddenly, well, no, it's not that kind of deal. We don't want that kind of deal. We want something different.
I think the vast majority of people in this country, whether Remain or Leave, now would be very satisfied for this to come to a amiable conclusion. And as you correctly just said, because when it does come to those in the opposition who claim to want this to end, and then introduce wrecking amendments, they introduce new objections to it, the general public are getting quite frustrated.
But you've got to understand that quite a lot of people don't get beyond a small area within Westminster, sometimes cliche referred to as the Westminster bubble, and go back to their own patch. Now, by and large, everybody hates their MP, except when they're at home, doing the fairs, wandering around, helping people. So they, in a way, they're cosseted to that great, which I feel is coming as a tsunami of change.
You were, of course, MP for Brentwood for
25 years.
Absolutely. What would you? I mean, of course, you resident there as well, despite being a proud Yorkshireman, obviously representing a good Essex seat. What would you say to your constituents right now? Hang in there; it'll be all right.
Well, it's different when you're a member of Parliament because you've got to kind of toe the government line a little bit. So one thing I've found now is I've got my weekend back and I say what I want, and I think I always say to our constituents is that it is pretty hopeless down there.
Excellent. Well, on that, I think, honest assessment, it's something I think the Parliamentary Review has always done quite well, talking frankly about problems, issues, and also not just good practice, but leadership. Well,
I was used to read it when I was a member of Parliament, because, what you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences, and I've always sort of found it quite a kind of a chatty magazine, but also you would see things that you would not automatically have come across. I certainly have attended the receptions over the year, and it's amazing the things you kind of pick up.
And I think it's important to stress it's not because politicians are uninterested, because honestly, as you'll know more than anyone, it's an issue of time. And to be able to have a channel and a platform where you can keep communication lines between businesses, schools and policymakers is so exceptionally important.
I think so, and it's important that it's beholden to nobody. People, pay to be part of the publication, pay for to be members, and it's a way of not beholden to government, not beholden to anything.
You're echoing the words, of course, your fellow Chairman Lord Blunkett has said. What some might not know is that you started your political journey perhaps even further left than David Blunkett.
Absolutely, I was a communist.
Now, what was it?
At the age of 14, I was bought the Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, and I read it from cover to cover. I tried to read it a few years back, and I just couldn't follow anything.
Oh, so I was going to say perhaps you might know the minds of the show front bench better than they do themselves.
From my position when I first joined, I would regard them as recalcitrant running dogs of the capitalist system.
Now, what was it then that moved you from radical Marxists to running the only inner city council controlled by the Conservatives in the 80s?
Well, I was very young, and I was fascinated by what was happening in what was then Czechoslovakia and Dubček, and the revolution that was taking place there inside communism, and the way in which he was repressed by Mr. Brezhnev, and the tanks and taking over. I was so angry, and I'm 16, remember. I'm really angry. And I thought, what's the most outrageous thing I can do? I will join the Conservative Party as a protest. And I kind of sticked around, and my family thought it was the funniest thing that ever happened to it. I was Eric the Tory. And
I think you announced this quite grandly as a grand protest.
I did indeed, but I kept going down, and it was an exciting time. People were developing the ideas of what the Conservative Party should be. Selsdon man, even Heath looked radical. We had different ideas, and it eventually clicked. And at some point, I became a Conservative, and that was 51 years ago. I think I'm definitely 100% a Tory now.
Through and through.
Through and through.
Although I do know the story. Most people might guess that a dialogue Conservative like yourself would have perhaps a portrait of Mr. Thatcher or Mr. Churchill in their office. But who is it that you have?
I'd Che Guevara. Which I always had him over my left shoulder for visitors, and they always used to you see their eyes going up and thinking, who, can't possibly be it. Someone asked me if it was Desi Arnaz. I thought it was married to Lucille Ball. But no, the reason I did that was to remind me and to remind my officials that without constant vigilance, the cigar-chomping commies would take over.
I'm sure David Bunk was in the room to reply then, actually. But in that long journey, you eventually ended up, of course, in 2010, doing something most Conservatives never thought they would have to do, but in a coalition government with, of all people, the Liberal Democrats.
That's right.
Now, something I think perhaps today more than ever, people and our politics seems to be almost wholly determined on how we voted in a referendum 3 years ago.
Yeah, the most normal thing would happen after something like that would be the country would come together, and if anything, we're more divided. I mean, I thought working in the coalition, I'm proud to have been part of that coalition. I'm proud to have worked alongside the Liberal Democrats, who I think realise that, like all minority partners in a coalition, they would suffer at the polls.
Do you think we've lost the ability recently as a people to work with those that we might disagree with on issues more than we used to?
I'm not sure that's right. I mean, you can see various members of the Conservative Party working closely with Liberal Democrats and Labour to defeat their own government, but it's not a thing I think I would want to encourage.
Quite. And I should remind listeners, we are recording this in Victoria, just over the road at Cardinal Place, a fantastically new development site which wouldn't have been there without some of your legislation. What was the proudest?
I personally approved it.
Absolutely. What was your proudest moment, do you think, in serving Secretary for 5 years?
It's my actual proudest moment. We did a thing called Troubled Families, which was the first centre-right attempt to deal with poverty and to deal with difficult families that were causing a disproportionately large amount of call upon the state, and it was on the basis of tough love. It was on the basis of getting people into jobs. It was about dealing with the family as a whole, not just one or two individuals that were having a problem. And I'm pleased that it's continued.
And since, I should very much stress that since, of course, you're stepped down to being an MP, you do have your weekends back, but that's not to say you haven't remained very active and very busy. Of course, continues the government's anti-corruption champion, shone the harsh light of day over malpractice in the local government. Indeed, the Queen's speech we've just had includes some of your recommendations from 2016. I think a couple of things on that. First of all, are you surprised, I may imagine you may not be, at some of the backlash towards, in this country, introducing voter ID for voting?
It is absurd, and it's particularly absurd coming from the Labour Party, because it was largely Labour's vulnerability that got my interest in trying to do something about it. And it's a bit like saying, you're requiring people to show some ID. That this is suppressing voting. It's a bit like saying the post office is suppressing parcels because they demand to see some ID. I think they've got a bee into their bonnet that this is something like that goes in the state to repress it. It's not. It's about giving confidence to the system. Now, the Electoral Commission and foreign observers have warned us for such a long time that our electoral system is vulnerable. And it's to misquote John Major, we are really sort of old males cycling to evensong and warband. Yeah, I mean, it's such a basic thing. It's an important thing. And it was kind of interesting in some of the trials. They did a focus group with a bunch of young Asian girls. And they said they thought the process of a photo ID would actually give them a greater confidence in the fairness of the system. I make all kinds of recommendations to stop postal vote harvesting, to stop various fraud taking place, to stop intimidation at counts, to stop intimidation outside polling stations.
And I think you referenced it earlier, the Westminster bubble. A lot of the places where this occurs and the places where this does go on are places where perhaps many people in the press don't usually go to.
No, they don't. We saw a YouGov poll that said the overwhelming majority, well in the 60%, thought this idea was sensible.
Yeah, and I imagine you're quite proud that recommendation is in the speech.
Yes, I mean, I'm a bit frustrated they didn't do it sooner, but nevertheless, I'm very happy that they are doing it.
It's as if the government's time has been taken up by something else and we've not focused on anything domestic.
Absolutely.
But with a man, though, with his roots in local government, do you think, and how much you've worked with that report, especially looking at them carefully, how would you rate our current state of local municipal politics?
Local government's very good. I mean, local government, don't get me wrong, it's by and large corruption-free, and it does a remarkably good job. And it was, in truth, my worries about local government and that these measures were brought in. I don't believe the fraud is big enough to be able to take a parliamentary seat, but it is big enough to take a council. And if you are negligent, uncaring about the probity of the poll, you're likely to be equally negligent about the awarding of contracts to your friends. So it's all past that. But local government is a very enduring part of our constitution. I've got a bit of stick because we had to take some money from them, but by and large they survive very well.
Excellent. Now, beyond obviously that work, you also, of course, the British envoy for post-Holocaust issues.
Yeah, sure.
Very dear to your heart. I know you've done some fantastic work recently, including with obviously former Shadow Chancellor from the Review, Ibbs. Would you mind, if you could just let the listeners know what projects you are working with and really the importance that has to so many communities around the country?
Well, I used to be very unpleasant about Ed Ball, and he used to be very unpleasant about me. But I found working with him remarkably easy, and we've not had a single row in 2 years, and by now we're beginning to be able to finish each other's sentences. We're building a memorial to the Holocaust next to Parliament with a learning centre below it, and the reason why the Prime Minister chose that site is that it was David Cameron, and he wanted to ensure that when people left the memorial, they would look and see Parliament and recognise that it was the last bastion against tyranny. But more important, to remind people who work in Parliament that the legislature has a choice. It can either protect its citizens or it can oppress its citizens. And we do know that it was a compliant legislature that brought in the Nuremberg laws. And at a time when there are parts of Europe that are seeking to rewrite their history and seeking to see themselves as only the victims of the Nazis. I'm determined that we should tell the truth in an unblinking way. We are, I suppose, at a critical crossroads when the last survivor is likely to be no longer with us within the next decade and a half. And at that point, we do know that history starts to be reassessed. I think it was Simon Sharma that talked about this. And he was referring to the French Revolution. And of course, most of the books written in the 1850s are the ones that have shaped our view of the French Revolution. But the difference is this, that slightly over 100 years ago, my grandfather Edgar grabbed hold of his Lee Enfield and walked out of a trench in the Somme and walked towards the Germans. And within a few minutes, most of the people he'd been brought up with, most of his friends were dead. Nobody doubts that he did that. But there's a whole industry out there that doubts that the Holocaust took place. So that's why it's important that we help frame that narrative.
And you reference as well, it's so important, especially at this time of history, so many years afterwards, that young people in schools get the correct education about it. How do we compare as a country in doing that compared to some of our European friends?
We I think, compare remarkably well, particularly because we've got a mixture of things. We ensure through the lessons of Auschwitz that 2 pupils from every secondary school go to Auschwitz each year, that they have a preliminary meeting, a visit and a wrap-up. We ensure that Holocaust Day is remembered in January. Now, I can remember starting that, or I'm not starting it, but being part of a foot soldier of people that put it together. And, it was like one man and a dog, but now it's quite a massive, it's a massive event. So I think we are quite good at remembering that. I think where we perhaps do need to have a wider understanding is beyond the death camps. And we need to kind of understand the Anstalt-Gruppen, which was the roving murder squads, how important they were. You were more likely to have been shot in a ditch than to end up in a death camp. The hinterland of that is Lithuania, where I was last week talking to colleagues, and through Belarus and the Ukraine. And it's really important that we ensure that we register where those death sites are.
And I think certainly, and I'm going to sit down next to speak, which certainly won't be too long away. It's something I think we'd be very happy to keep updates on how that project is going, because it's so important and people do need to be aware of it. Looking to the future, though, I imagine you were actually very content and happy because the former Prime Minister, friend and colleague David Cameron just released his book, and you were quite unscathed from it.
I came out, he was very nice about it. I even bought the audio version because he was reading it, and he obviously, but there was a fair bit of affection, and I'm rather glad they left out 1 or 2 of the other embarrassing things.
Maybe another time.
Yeah.
Yes, but it's important, I think, and I'm conscious of the time, but I think it's important that today people have become so perhaps caught up in what's happening in this country regarding Brexit. Looking to the future, what would you say that it's a positive thing that this country has to look forward to?
Well, we're a large trading nation. We're a large economy. We're a liberal democracy, and it would be good to get through Brexit over the coming years. And it would be good to start to look at some of the social issues that we need to tackle, those that have been left behind by our economic progress. And it would be good to see some solid investment in this country, both in terms of its infrastructure, but also in terms of the way it operates as a democracy.
And I know that's going to be a huge focus of the next review. Pickles, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
As always, it's been a pleasure interviewing and learning from our guests. I hope you all enjoyed listening. Until next time, I'm off to stargaze in the park as I consider what the limit really can be on raising standards. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. You can find every episode on iTunes, YouTube and Spotify. The views expressed by each guest in the podcast are their own. They do not represent the opinions of the Parliamentary Review, Westminster Publications, Lord Pickles, Lord Blunkett, David Curry or any other guest on the podcast. If you'd like to know more about the Parliamentary Review, please visit www.theparliamentaryreview.co.uk.